Afghans usually refer to this war as the Soviet War in Afghanistan, or as the Afghan Jihad. However, it is often referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, with the Russians calling it the Afghan War, or simply Afghan, in a similar fashion to how the US refers to the Vietnam War as simply Vietnam, or just Nam. The conflict in Afghanistan began at Christmas in 1979, and dragged on for a further 9 years, causing the deaths of over 25,000 Soviet soldiers and countless casualties. It was an intervention meant to support the Afghan communist government against the Mujahideen, who believed themselves to be fighting on behalf of God. For the Soviets, the invasion had huge consequences, being unable to defeat a determined and relentless guerrilla army. In early 1980, President Jimmy Carter withdrew from the SALT II treaty, causing a breakdown of the ongoing arms limitation talks and agreements between the two Cold War superpowers. Then later in summer, the USA and 65 other countries boycotted the Moscow Olympic Games. For Afghanistan, with its lengthy history of interference from foreign powers, the campaign caused death and devastation, and only exacerbated the civil conflict already going on between its people. Ultimately, the withdrawal of the demoralised Russian forces helped to further collapse the USSR. Welcome to Wars of the World. To understand the start of the Russian intervention in Afghanistan, we have to travel all the way back to the imperialism of the 1730s. It was then that Central Asia first caught the attention of Tsarist Russia, and the gradual conquest of the area began during a program of expansion, which saw Russia advance south into the Caucasus and Crimea, as well as into Serbia, from the Ural Mountains in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. By the late 1830s, Russia had turned its interest on Afghanistan. In the aftermath of the Russo-Persian War of 1826-28, Russia began to subtly influence government circles in Tehran, and by 1837, when Persian forces attempted to seize Herat in western Afghanistan, Russian advisors and mercenaries went along to support the venture. In Calcutta, the capital of British India, and the headquarters of the East India Company, which oversaw Britain's territories in India, there was concern over Russia's increasing threat to the independence of Afghanistan. Threatening to step in, they successfully forced a Persian withdrawal, but as far as Anglo-Russian relations were concerned, the damage was done. This heralded the beginning of the Great Game, a rivalry between the Russian and British empires for influence in Central Asia, but mainly over Afghanistan and the northern regions of India, ruled by the British Raj with its undefined borders. The Brits knew that if the buffer of Afghanistan came under Russian control, then their position in India would become vulnerable. And so, in 1838, the British and East India Company forces invaded Afghanistan first, in order to neutralise the perceived Russian threat. Meanwhile, prior to the Anglo-Indian army crossing the border, the Afghans had actually refused to accept the Russian envoy at their capital, Kabul. Yet concerns over Russia continued despite the Tsar's humiliating defeat at the hands of the British and French at the end of the Crimean War in 1856. Still, by 1869, the Russian frontier had reached Afghanistan's northern border. The British Raj had invaded Afghanistan yet again in 1878, but withdrew 3 years later, having obtained a number of allowances, such as the authority to control Afghan foreign affairs. It wasn't until 1907 that the Great Game came to an end, and the Anglo-Russian Convention was eventually signed. Britain acknowledged that Central Asia and northern Iraq as being under the Russian Empire's influence, and Russia accepted that Afghanistan and southern Iraq were under the British empires. The two kingdoms came together as they both focused on opposing the German Empire. The treaty then collapsed in 1919 after Afghan troops crossed over the border into British India to incite a revolt, and once again Britain invaded in a third Anglo-Afghan war. As a result of this political settlement, Afghan gained complete independence from British control. Between 1919 and 1978, Afghanistan played a balancing act between the demands of exterior powers such as the US, Britain and Germany, as well as those from their nearby neighbours. After taking the throne in 1933, King Mohammad Zahir Shah had ruled Afghanistan until his former Prime Minister and cousin, Mohammad Dawood Khan, formed a coup in 1973. Dawood was attempting to bring about reform with the eradication of Islamic fundamentalism, social modernization, and the emancipation of women. The Islamists, who were against these changes, travelled across the border into Pakistan, where they were trained by the Pakistani Secret Service. Among them were Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud, two men who would subsequently play a significant part in the Afghan civil war 20 years later, both of them being members of the Mujahideen. After a disagreement with the Afghan Communist Party, also known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, Dawood dismissed the Soviet advisors sent by their leader, Leonid Brezhnev, despite having been receiving arms shipments from the Soviet Union. Now there were concerns being raised in Russia that Afghanistan would soon form an alliance with the West. The final straw came in April of 1977, during Dawood's state visit to Moscow. When Brezhnev protested against the expansion of NATO and US power in Afghanistan, Dawood was outraged. He bit back, quote, "We will never allow you to dictate to us how to run our country and who we employ in Afghanistan. Afghanistan will remain poor if necessary, but free in its acts and decisions." End quote. Dawood even had to be prompted to shake Brezhnev's hand before he left. His show of defiance was a decision he would come to regret. In the spring of 1978, a high-ranking member of the Communist Party was assassinated. With emotions running high amid the party members, Dawood sensed danger and tried to implement a crackdown. However, the Sour Revolution was successfully staged by the PDPA. Dawood and his family were shot in the presidential palace. Although the Soviet Union took no part in the coup, Brezhnev did nothing to prevent it. Dawood's death was kept a secret, as the pro-Soviet Nur Mohammad Taraki became the new president, and it was announced that Dawood had resigned for health reasons. The country was renamed the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and was given a red flag like that of the Soviet Union. Dawood's body was eventually found 30 years later, and he was buried with full state honours in 2008. With Taraki as the PDPA's leader, Marxist reform was the order of the day. Education was promoted, as was, most controversially, the empowerment of women, with the banning of forced marriages and the discouragement of women wearing a veil. The government never referred to itself as communist. Within the PDPA, there were two factions: the Khalqis, led by Taraki, and the Pachamis, which is a more moderate group led by Babrak Kamel. And so the administration was split along factional lines, with Babrak Kamel and the other Parcham leaders facing up against Taraki and Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin of the Khalq Party. Even though the new government was quick to side with the Soviet Union, many Soviet diplomats thought that the Khalqis' aspirations to change Afghanistan would soon incite a rebellion from the country's conservative social and religious populace. From the outset, the Khalqis began a systematic persecution of the Parchamis, especially as the Soviet Union preferred the Parchami faction, with their less radical and slower approach to change. For the conservative Afghans, the changes were too much and too soon. Land reforms meant that local needs were ignored, and the idea of liberated women was an outrage to the Islamic Afghans, who believed that a woman's place was in the home. Conflicts within the PDPA led to Parcham members being exiled, purged, and executed. Before the Soviets had intervened, the Khalq state executed between 10 and 27,000 people, primarily at Pul-e-Khaki jail. Political scientist Olivier Roy calculated that during the Taraki-Amin period, between 50,000 and 100,000 persons vanished. The modernizing reforms in Afghanistan were seen as being in direct conflict with the teachings of Islam. Early in 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power in Iran. The USSR initially believed that Khomeini, with his anti-US regime, would be an ally. But with Iran's Islamic Revolution and its policy to export its doctrines to countries with similar militant beliefs in the region, Khomeini began to supply arms to the Afghan Mujahideen, the Muslim soldiers of God, who hated the irreverent PDPA and its Soviet supporters. Taraki ordered a crackdown on his opponents and formed the secret police, which he dubbed the Afghan Interests Protection Service. Thousands of Afghanis were imprisoned and executed. Inevitably, the people started to rise up, and a rebellion began in the city of Herat in March of 1979. Chants of "God is great" were heard from the Mujahideen as hundreds of Afghans and Soviet advisors were flayed alive, and men, women and children were tortured and murdered under the orders of Taraki's right-hand man, Hafizullah Amin. While Amin was on his rampage, Taraki pleaded with the Soviet Union for practical and technical assistance with men and armaments, but the request fell on deaf ears, as fearing the reaction of their own Muslim population, they refused to get dragged into what they saw as a Soviet Vietnam. The Soviet Premier, Alexei Kosygin, said, quote, "We believe it would be a fatal mistake to commit ground troops. If our troops went in, the situation in your country would not improve. On the contrary, it would get worse." End quote. Brezhnev suggested easing back on the reforms and to remove Amin as prime minister, because complete Soviet intervention would, quote, "only play into the hands of our enemies, both yours and ours." End quote. In 1979, on his way back from a conference in Cuba, Taraki met with Brezhnev in Moscow and was able to secure some Soviet support. In Afghanistan, the Herat uprising had turned into an open revolt between the government and the anti-regime resistance. Now the entire country was at war. Aware of the threat to his life, Amin managed to avoid an assassination attempt by Taraki, and instead, with the backing of a contingent of army officers, he then had Taraki arrested. Taraki was supposedly suffocated in his cell in October of 1979, but the Afghan media made no mention of Taraki's murder. Instead, they reported that he had passed away from an illness. Now Amin was in charge, but the regime was collapsing. There were discussions in Moscow on whether to send in Soviet troops. Amin was seen as a fanatical and incompetent leader, but there was an assumption that the US and China were sponsoring the Mujahideen in Afghanistan through their alliance with Pakistan. The hope was that the Soviets could swap out the hardline Khalqi communist Amin with the more moderate Parchami communist Babrak Karmal. Chief of Soviet Army General Staff, Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, raised concerns over the possibility of a prolonged guerrilla war, but his fears were dismissed, insisting that the occupation of Afghanistan would be both straightforward and short. Amin's revolutionary government was no longer trusted by the Afghan people. Their unpopularity was a result of their unwanted reforms, disorganized administration, failing economy, police brutality, and what the people saw as anti-Muslim policies. In just 20 months of Khalqist rule, Afghanistan had declined in every aspect of daily life. Now the USSR believed that without intervention, Amin's government would be overrun by the Mujahideen, and the country would be lost to an administration hostile to the Soviets. Amin had to be removed. Preparation soon began, with the basis for the occupation being to 1. Stabilize the country by occupying major cities, air bases, supply facilities, and key routes. 2. To relieve the Afghan forces from their garrison duties so they could directly fight against the insurgency in the countryside. 3. To supply the Afghan army with intelligence, artillery, air and logistical support. 4. Have minimum contact with the local population. 5. Accept a small number of Soviet casualties. And 6. To strengthen Afghan forces to enable the withdrawal of the Soviet army when the opposition was defeated. Early in December, 1,500 troops were sent in to Bagram Air Force Base, just north of Kabul, where 400 troops had already been stationed since the summer. This was an arrangement that Amin was likely happy with, as he believed that the men were there to protect his regime. Additional air support began preparations for the operation in mid-December, and motorized rifle divisions were assembled and moved to staging points on the border between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Ground and tactical aviation forces were strengthened. The Soviets were ready to move in. It was on Christmas Day of 1979 that the Soviets made their move, and the massive airlift of troops and equipment began, all under the pretense of bringing international aid to Afghanistan. The official order given by Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov was that, quote, "The state frontier of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan is to be crossed on the ground and in the air by forces of the 40th Army and the Air Force at 1500 hours." End quote. Airborne units already in Turkestan moved in, along with those in the west and the south of the USSR. Around 4,000 soldiers from at least 2 regiments travelled to Kabul in armoured vehicles, while smaller groups moved into Shindand and Kandahar. Amin was fully aware of all military movements, having requested assistance from the Soviets over a week earlier. On the 23rd of December, the Russian newspaper Pravda, which was the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, issued a denial of combat troops being in Afghanistan. However, it was of no surprise to Amin when thousands of airborne Soviet soldiers finally arrived, as he had already been informed that his request for troops had been granted from Moscow. Amin thanked the Russians and even gave instructions to the DRA Armed Forces General Staff to give support to the deploying men. He was unaware of the Soviets' real motive, and was convinced to relocate to Taj Beg Palace, high on a steep hill in Kabul, on the pretext that it would be easier to defend him there. Spetsnaz Special Forces stormed the heavily fortified palace on the 27th of December 1979, and Amin, along with his family and advisors, were killed. The Khalqist leader of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Hafizullah Amin, was now dead. Within 48 hours, Babak Karmal, the leader of the Parcham faction of the PDPA, was brought out of exile in Eastern Europe and became the new president. Now the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan had begun. Across the world, the condemnation of the Soviet Union was swift, viewing this as an invasion of a defenseless country. Jimmy Carter, in the final days of his US presidency, called the invasion, quote, "the most serious threat to world peace since the Second World War," end quote, and withdrew from the SALT II Treaty on the 2nd of January 1980. 1 week later, the UN Security Council called an emergency session, and Soviet actions were strongly criticized. By the end of the month, 34 Muslim-majority countries condemned the Soviet intervention and demanded the immediate, urgent, and unconditional withdrawal of Soviet troops, including Afghanistan's worried neighbour, Pakistan. The belief was, especially in the US, that inaction would only encourage the USSR to extend their control to adjacent countries. Carter put in place a trade embargo. 66 nations boycotted the Moscow Olympics, and supplies of weapons to the rebels were made accessible through many nations. Prior to the Soviet invasion, the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, and Kuwait all provided minimal support to the insurgents, but now aid significantly increased. Having entered Afghanistan along 2 ground routes and 1 air corridor, Soviet forces quickly seized control of the country's main cities, military bases, and strategic facilities. The Soviets had expected to be looked upon as liberators who had freed the country from Amin's brutal rule, and that the Mujahideen would surrender immediately. Instead, the presence of Soviet troops had the opposite effect, and only intensified feelings of nationalism, leading to further rebellion. Although the Red Army tried to leave the fighting to the Afghans, they often found themselves sucked into the hostilities, and fighting against urban unrest, tribal forces known as Lashkar, and sometimes even against rebelling Afghan army units. During the first days of the occupation, attacks against Soviet troops were common on the streets of Kabul, and they were often killed by civilians in broad daylight. Supply trucks and armoured vehicles continued to pour into the country. In just a few weeks, somewhere between 50 and 60,000 Red Army soldiers had arrived. Over 4,000 civilian advisors and technicians had also been brought in to help set up and run the new administration, led by Babrak Kamal. In cities such as Kandahar and Herat, there were sporadic outbursts of civil unrest. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, guerrillas in the north and eastern parts of Afghanistan escalated their assaults, clashing with the loyal Afghan army. Kamal called his regime a new evolutionary phase of the glorious April Revolution. His provisional constitution forbade torture, persecution, and punishment, contrary to human dignity. But despite his guarantees to the right of free expression, he failed at uniting the PDPA. In the eyes of many Afghans, he was still seen as a puppet of the Soviet Union. By the spring, there were 81,000 Red Army soldiers in Afghanistan. Just 2 months after Soviet intervention, in February of 1980, there was a major rebellion in Kabul known as the Three Hoot Uprising against the Kamal-led government. Thousands of Islamists and leftists took part. There were mass arrests, and hundreds of protesters were killed in the chaos. At the same time, the Soviet push into Paktia in the east of Afghanistan resulted in the loss of a Soviet battalion. Then, during April and May, Soviet soldiers and PDPA allies massacred dozens of protesting students, as another city rebellion once again took a perilous turn. The war now began to take on a new pattern. The Afghan Mujahideen, whom the Soviet army soldiers referred to as the enemy or Dushman, split up into smaller units and fought a guerrilla war in the mountains, while the Soviets controlled the cities and the main lines of communication. The 105th Airborne and the equivalent of 7 motorized rifle divisions went into Afghanistan in a matter of months, a total of some 85,000 troops sent to prevent the toppling of the communist regime in Kabul. While the Soviets were quick to take control of all the cities and primary routes of communication, they lacked the tools and the know-how to defeat the Mujahideen, who were wandering the hostile countryside. Having failed to draw out their enemy, the Soviets decimated land, crops, farms, irrigation systems, and cattle as part of their scorched earth program after failing to engage their adversary. As a result, more than 5 million Afghan people left their homes to cross the borders into Pakistan and Iran, where they were housed in sizable refugee camps. Fighting an enemy that saw death as an honor and as a way to achieve martyrdom, it was a terrifying and harsh experience for the young recruits of the Soviet army and Afghanistan. The Soviets were despised by both the Mujahideen and most of the Afghanistan's population, for their atheism and their lack of faith was seen as an abomination. Fighting an unwinnable enemy in a hostile foreign land, the war quickly became Russia's Vietnam. With such high casualty rates among the young Soviet soldiers, they were given the nickname Zinky Boys, after the zinc-lined coffins that brought the fallen back to their homeland. It had become obvious that in order to completely destroy their opposition of 200,000 Mujahideen, that hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops would be needed. By early 1982, the number of Soviet troops had reached somewhere between 105 and 110,000 men. By the end of the year, the Soviets had suffered as many as 10,000 casualties. By the autumn of 1982, when the late Leonid Brezhnev was succeeded as the head of state by former KGB leader Yuri Andropov, the Soviet war in Afghanistan was changing in a subtle but significant way. The intentional migratory genocide assaults had stayed the same, in order to demoralize the civilian population and to eliminate all residents in the countryside who were helping the Mujahideen. Now added to this strategy was the methodical implementation of KGB-style subversion, such as the use of both economic and psychological pressures, agent provocateurs, bribes, and threats of imprisonment, as a way to invite or split loyalty among the resistance, tribes, and ethnic clans. After becoming US President in 1981, Ronald Reagan increased the shipment of guns and aid to the Mujahideen through both Pakistan and its intelligence service, the ISI, or the Inter-Services Intelligence. This resistance movement that was costing Moscow so dearly, not just in monetary terms, but also in the loss of men and dignity, was being assisted by the US, Pakistan, UK, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and China, as well as others. With international relations at a breaking point, as the US saw the conflict in Afghanistan as a fundamental part of the Cold War, the CIA provided assistance to anti-Soviet forces in a program called Operation Cyclone to arm and finance the Afghan Mujahideen. This meant that Pakistan's northwest frontier province became a base for the Afghan resistance fighters. In addition to financial support, Muslim nations volunteered thousands of Afghan Arabs who wished to wage jihad against the atheist communists. Among them was the now infamous Osama bin Laden, a young Saudi who founded an Arab organization that later became Al-Qaeda. By the end of the conflict, the US had sunk $3 billion into financing the Mujahideen. 1981 once again saw heavy fighting in Herat, and an unsuccessful operation of Afghan Republican forces into the northern province of Balkh. By 1984, the insurgents were being encouraged to undertake sabotage raids inside the USSR. The rebels began cross-border attacks in the spring of 1985. 2 years later, the Afghan rebels began coordinated incursions on several targets over the Soviet border, and in the case of an attack on a factory in Uzbek SSR, they went as far as 10 miles inside Soviet territory. The Soviets then threatened to invade Pakistan in response to the trans-border strikes, and no further incidents were reported. The Afghan guerrilla commander Ahmed Shah Massoud proved to be a thorn in the Soviet side. In 1983, they called a truce with the military leader, but that only gave him time to restructure, strengthen, and increase his forces. Despite Kamal sending his head of secret police, Mohammad Najibullah, to find Massoud and have him killed, the attempt failed, as did many others. However, eventually in 2001, Massoud, who actively fought against the Taliban from the time the regime rose to power in 1996, was assassinated 2 days before the 9/11 attacks in America. In March of 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Just as they had once blamed Amin for the problems in Afghanistan, the Soviets now came to regard Karmal as a failure. Gorbachev stated that, quote, "The main reason that there has been no national consolidation so far is that Comrade Karmal is hoping to continue sitting in Kabul with our help." He also told the Soviet Politburo, the highest executive authority in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, quote, "If we don't change approaches to evacuate Afghanistan, we will be fighting there for another 20 or 30 years." End quote. It's unclear exactly when the Soviet authorities started pushing for Karmal's termination, but in 1982, Andrei Gromyko spoke with UN Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar about Karmal's resignation. Gorbachev's plan was to replace Karmal with Mohammad Najibullah, an Afghan military officer and politician often known as Dr. Najib. In 1980, he had become head of the Afghan secret police, better known as the KHAD, and as a member of the Parcham faction led by Karmal, Najibullah was known to be brutally efficient. In November 1985, Karmal realized that he had lost all support from the Soviet Union, and therefore he resigned, being exiled to Moscow where he died in 1996. In May of that year, Najibullah was elected General Secretary and then President of the Revolutionary Council. Although at the time, the Afghan people didn't know the relatively young new leader, he quickly implemented reforms to improve the nation's circumstances and to gain support, using ideas determined by the Soviet Communist Party specialists. Being able to speak fluently in both Pashto and Dari languages, Najibullah was able to interact with elders. In a clever move, he also interjected his speeches with passages from the Quran, to support his claims and to portray both himself and the state as Islamic. The night curfew in Kabul, which had been in effect since 1980, was finally removed, and several rebel prisoners were released. At the same time, the US and UK military were helping to train the Mujahideen, providing the rebels with consignments of the highly effective FIM-92 Stinger, a surface-to-air missile that could easily be carried by mule and launched from the shoulder. The use of these weapons meant that the Soviet helicopters had to fly too high to provide air cover for their ground troops, greatly increasing the Mujahideen's fortunes. Unfortunately, within 15 years, many of these US-taught rebels would go over to the Taliban, and then use their training and skills against the very nations that had helped to develop them. Afghanistan and Pakistan signed the Geneva Accords in 1988, after lengthy discussions. Both the United States and the Soviet Union backed the two Asian nations in their pledge to avoid meddling in one another's affairs. Additionally, they consented to the voluntary return of Afghan refugees in Pakistan. The two countries reached an agreement to stop meddling in Afghanistan, which included the Soviet Union pulling out. A special mission was established by the UN to supervise the procedure. President Najibullah had thus successfully solidified his political standing and was able to start coordinating with Moscow's efforts to withdraw. The Geneva Accords had established, among other things, a timeline for the complete Soviet withdrawal and for the US and Soviet non-intervention in the affairs of both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Gorbachev's new thinking on domestic and foreign policy helped to pave the way for the withdrawal. He wanted to transform the USSR with his glasnost concept of openness and transparency, and perestroika policy to restructure the country's economy and to end the era of stagnation. It was a move away from the old Soviet model of a closed society and secretive governance. As a way of further easing Cold War tensions, Gorbachev also signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with the US in 1987. As the invasion reached its final phase, Soviet forces began their withdrawal whilst restricting their remaining troops from launching further offensive actions. Between May and August 1988 and November and February 1989, the first and second halves of the Red Army were removed, the Soviets having negotiated ceasefires with the local Mujahideen commanders to guarantee a safe transit. For the most part, the withdrawal went peacefully, except for Operation Typhoon, which was carried out in January 1989, with the sole intention of causing as much damage as possible to the opposition forces in the central and northern provinces of the country. According to Soviet estimates, the assault killed over 600 of Massoud's fighters. The last Soviet troops left Afghanistan on the 15th of February 1989. The very last Soviet soldier to leave Afghanistan was named General Boris Gromov. On having crossed Friendship Bridge into Soviet Uzbekistan, he said, quote, "There is not a single Soviet soldier or officer left behind me. Our 9-year war is over." End quote. But for the Afghans, a new war was just about to begin. Mohammad Najibullah and his government remained in power until April the 15th, 1992. On that day, Najibullah resigned as Mujahideen forces moved into Kabul. His attempt to fly to India under UN protection was prevented, and so he took refuge at a UN compound in the city. After 4 bloody years of fighting between various groups of anti-Najibullah forces, it was the Taliban who took control of Kabul. After storming the UN compound in September of 1996, Najibullah was tortured and then killed. According to retired General Mohammad Yahya Nawroz of the Army of Afghanistan, quote, "The Afghan-Soviet War was a rare confrontation in history, as it helped trigger the collapse of the greatest empire of modern times. Lessons learned from the conflict were gathered by both sides. Whatever else these lessons may show, the most fundamental of them is that no army, however sophisticated, well-trained, materially rich, numerically overwhelming and ruthless, can succeed on the battlefield if it is not psychologically fit and motivated for the fight. The force, however destitute in material advantages and numbers, which can rely on the moral quantities of a strong faith, stubborn determination, individualism, and unending patience, will always be the winner. These may not be the optimum qualities always found in the armies of Western democracies." End quote. In 1989, the American journalist Patrick Brogan summed up the Soviets' defeat at the hands of the Afghan Mujahideen succinctly when he wrote, quote, "The simplest explanation is probably the best. They got sucked into Afghanistan much as the United States got sucked into Vietnam, without clearly thinking through the consequences and wildly underestimating the hostility they would arouse.